Next, West Virginia University professor Tyler Boulware and his class discuss the Indian slave trade in the South between 1670 and 1720. Spurred by trade with European settlers, tribes like the Chickasaw raided neighbors for captives more frequently than they had in the years before colonization. Professor Boulware explains how these interactions affected both native and colonial societies for years by pushing Indians further inland, destabilizing smaller tribes and driving them to war. This class is about an hour.
Today we're talking about, in a little bit more detail, the Indian slave trade in the Lower South. And I say more detail because last class I gave you a reading, a primary source reading, a fairly lengthy one that I think most of you read in full, unless you cheat into the keyword searches. But I asked you to look specifically at John Lawson's travels through the Carolinas about 1700, and to get you to think about what he says in terms of Indian economies, Indian trade, and specifically the Indian slave trade and Indian slavery. Just little snippets there. And so what I want to do today is to delve more deeply into these issues. And so I gave you a reading, a chapter from Christina Snyder's fairly recent book on slavery in Indian country. And on page 75, she writes that Chickasaw and Appalachee experiences could not have been more different. And so I'll throw this question out to you here that you see on the bottom. How would their experiences compare? And what does that tell us about the Lower South during this time? And we could start with the Chickasaw. So who wants to start us off looking at their trajectory and how they engaged the slave trade? Because they're really the bulk. They really keep appearing in this chapter, more so than the Appalachee, which kind of, pay off at the end there. Chickasaw, what can you tell me about the Chickasaw? Yeah, Quinn.
They participated in the transatlantic trade.
All right. Participation in the transatlantic trade. That is key. Who wants to elaborate on what's important about this trade? Nicole?
Basically, they were either like slaved or be slaved because they were small in numbers, but they were able to dominate the slave trade by doing raids with other tribes and then trading them to South Carolina and Virginia.
All right, very good. This is a small group of, relatively speaking, a small group of people, especially when you compare them to, say, their near neighbors, which we'll talk about today, the Choctaw, and others like the Appalachee, who are very formidable in terms of population. But they tap into this trade, and they are able to use these connections to European markets, specifically the English, that allow them to maintain their survival and their sovereignty and their homeland and so forth. What is important about this trade? You kind of alluded to it, but what's important about this trade? The key aspect here, Richie.
Well, through evolution of the trade, it eventually becomes much more profitable for them to raid other peoples and capture them and sell them as slaves as compared to concentrating on the fur trade as they had started with.
All right.
It was much more profitable.
Okay, two things that Richie said that are pretty important to pick up on. One is the importance of the deerskin trade. Now, we're going to talk mostly about the Indian slave trade in this class, but the deerskin trade is also very important, and we'll see that here in one of the slides that I have. And between 1700 and 1715, with the height of the slave trade, there's about 50,000 deerskin that are leaving the port of Charleston. So while we're going to focus on one cornerstone of these trading relationships, let's not forget that also the deerskin trade is important. And once the slave trade ends, the deerskin trade will even become more important later on in the 18th century. And the second thing that you said was the economic benefits of participating in this trade. And that's another thing that we'll recap as we get to the PowerPoint here in a second, looking at economic motivations. There were two sets of motivations that Indians really thought about and used in engaging this trade. There's cultural, and then there's economic. And the economic ones are pretty powerful, as we'll talk about. What else can you tell me about the Chickasaw that made them so powerful? They were a small group. If you had to say one or two answers, what is most crucial here? Ian?
They started trading with the British and gave them guns.
Good.
The Appalachee didn't have.
Very good. That the Appalachee and other Indians that were connected to the Spanish did not have. That they were allied to the English. Okay, first of all, that's very important. And what did the English bring? They brought guns. And so the Chickasaw, for a period of time, were the only people in the lower Mississippi that had access to these guns. Now I'm going to ask you this question. Bows and arrows are pretty effective weapons. You can fire them very quickly. What makes these firearms, these flintlocks, so important, and why would they shift to that? Chase.
One big thing is the psychological part of it. Like whenever you have these loud bangs and flashes coming from these guns, it not only kills people, but it scares them as well.
All right, very good. The psychological aspect of these weapons, the noise, the smoke, and the fear and the panic. As Snyder writes, she says, not great for hunting when you're trying to use stealth and quiet, but for warfare, they were great because they would unsettle these villages that they would attack by bringing in these firearms, especially if they had not seen them before and if they did not have them. What else would you say is an advantage of the firearm, the guns, that bows and arrows don't have, that Snyder talked about in her chapter? Yeah.
Well, I mean, they're highly effective. They shoot straight as opposed to parabolic arrow shot. So
Good.
The damage that's done is usually, one, you're hitting your target more, and two, there's a higher rate of fatality.
Good. They were expert with these weapons. They had a range of 300 yards, which is much farther than bows and arrows. And what else did you say?
They shot straight as opposed to parabolic.
Okay. Yeah, that and then the damage. The damage that these bullets will do as opposed to an arrow. Okay, good. So what else do we have about the Chickasaw? What else can you tell me about the Chickasaw that made them slavers, effective slavers, again, their trajectory and so forth? Yeah, Nicole.
They had a lot of allies, which they used to their advantage.
Good. And not just English allies, right? Is that what you're saying?
Like native tribes.
Very
yeah.
good. And that's one thing that I'm glad you picked up on, is that this English alliance is critical, but also that they're not just totally making enemies among all their neighbors, that they are very selective and strategic about who they're befriending, like the Natchez is one of their allies. Anything else? What happens to the Chickasaw? Well, how does this story end before we move to the Appalachee? How does their story end? Ian?
Their numbers diminished because of all the war they were going through to go through these raids to get their slaves.
Okay, this is not just, hey, I got a gun and I'm raiding the village and it's a piece of cake. As we'll see with the Choctaw and Chickasaw, these were very destructive raids, and peoples on both sides lost their lives. And so one is population loss, and that's something to keep in mind. I'm not going to talk about it in great detail, but this combines with the slave trade to really decimate native populations in the Lower South. You do see loss of population, where they go from around, 7,500 to 4,000 at the end of the slave trade. What else can you tell me about their story? Richie?
Well, on top of capturing lots of people and selling them, they would also take people they captured into their own communities, because, as we just said, we're talking about their diminishing numbers. They replenish their numbers, their population, through their capturing of slaves.
Good. And this answer ties into a lot of other
children.
questions. What was that last part?
Specifically women and children.
Good. And this answer ties into a lot of the questions I was going to ask you that we'll get to here in a second. But adoption into native communities, it's not just, one of the questions I have is, what happened to these peoples who were taken captive? And part of the answer is that some of them were incorporated into Native American clans and communities. So for the Chickasaw, for example, and we'll talk about the Iroquois, the Creek, the Yamasee, and all these others that will incorporate these what they would formerly foreigners or enemies into their communities. So what's the end story for the Chickasaw? Do they lose their identity as a people? Or they run off their land? What? New voice. What happens to him in the end? I mean, I'm not projecting to removal period, but at the end of this story, what do we see happening with the Chickasaw? Was it let me ask you this: was it an effective strategy what they did, turning to becoming slavers, as one anthropologist, Robbie Etheridge, said, a militaristic slave-raiding society? Was it an effective strategy?
Yes and no. Yes, in that it allowed them to prosper for a long time. I mean, not only were they successful as a small tribe, but they were able to prosper as a small tribe, or a relatively small tribe. However, whenever they started taking in captives and making them part of their families, they started to lose their identity more and more. And it gets to the point to where, at one point in the reading, it says that a man named Northwest claimed that he was one of only 2 original Chickasaws left in the world.
But you don't believe him?
No.
All right. That's what we have to question our sources. And even Snyder says that's probably a major exaggeration. Right. But you're exactly right. It does bring in different cultural elements, different languages, different cultural practices, and so forth. And that has an impact on their identity. But in terms of their ethnic identity and their polity, their government, what happens? Are they decimated? Is it like the Appalachee? No. We see them maintain their homeland. They're small numbers, but we see them maintain their homeland and their sovereignty. Now let's jump to the Appalachee, because the Chickasaw kind of ground this chapter that we read, and the Appalachee will appear later. What happens to them? Who are they? Who are their allies? What happens to them? Nicole?
They were basically like a huge Mississippian chiefdom, and they had like 30,000 people when DeSoto showed up, and after that, the like epidemics, and they just kept dwindling down in numbers because of that, and war and things like that.
Okay, disease and war certainly take a toll on their population. That during the DeSoto expeditions, that they numbered as many as 30,000. By the time we get to the slave trade, it's more like about 10,000, but still a very formidable people. So what happens to them? Quinn.
I think a lot of them got sold or enslaved, and then there were others that they say got absorbed into Louisiana and Florida and all that.
Good. And I'm going to hold on to your answer because I'm going to return to it in just a second. But they are especially targeted, and that's what you're getting at. They were especially targeted during these slave raids. Why? Richie?
One of the major reasons is they had no weapons, they had no guns.
And why is that? Who are their allies?
The Spanish.
Good. The Spanish, and we're going to talk about the mission system, where the Spaniards tried to bring their religion and their civilization to native peoples with limited success, but they're not trading guns to them. And that's not good when you have aggressive slave raiders coming down from the north to attack you. And so that's a major reason that their particular location, the fact that they don't have access to guns, and that their ally, the Spanish, are fairly weak. And that's all going to play into their demise. And so we get back to Quinn's answer is what eventually happens to the Appalachee. And they are attacked and they are displaced from their homeland. You're going to see a number of them, as you mentioned, a number of them are going to be incorporated into Yamasee and Creek communities. Thousands are going to be sold into slavery. We'll talk about that. And there are going to be some who relocate to the French in Louisiana to seek protection with the French, as you read about. And then a number will, surrender to the English, and they will relocate from the Tallahassee. This is all in the Tallahassee region of Florida. There's no Florida State fans in here, are there? Okay, good. And they will relocate to the Savannah River area of South Carolina, and so they're going to be under the protection of the English government. So, with that said, we see two major differences here with looking at these experiences. So, how do we describe the Lower South? What if you just did it in one word? What would you say about the Lower South from, say, 1670 to 1720? Brandon?
It's factional.
Factional. Very good. And that ties into a later question I have is why, and Snyder asked this, why did Indians attack one another? Part of the answer is factional. What do you mean by that, and what did she mean by that? Yes, Ian, why?
They didn't see each other as Indians. They saw each other as their own tribes.
Very good. There is no Indian identity. Race is a non-issue. And so as she writes, the most important thing to native peoples in terms of identity and belonging and protection is what?
Kinship.
Kinship. Very good. And so if you were not kin, you were an other. You were an enemy. You were a foreigner. And so you were, you were prime target. Very good. What else? Why else would native peoples attack one another? We talked about economic reasons. Any other cultural reasons that we didn't touch upon in any detail? Cultural reasons for war.
The Chickasaws have been warring their whole culture. They had like two leaders, one civil leader, one war leader.
Okay, looking at the political structure of these communities, and that actually the Chickasaw, some of the evidence points to the Chickasaw changing and reorganizing their society so that they become a militaristic slave-raiding society because it was so beneficial economically, but also in terms of survival and protection. So that's some things to keep in mind there. Okay, a couple other questions we'll finish with before we move on to the PowerPoint. I guess I could ask you more about descriptions of the Lower South. We didn't really flesh that out that much. what else would you say besides factional? We don't want to quit on one word. We know that when I ask you questions, I like at least 5 answers.
Violent.
Violent. Great description. What else?
Like tension-filled, because people kept breaking their allies and they didn't know who to trust. And
Very good. As we, I think we talked about last class, and as we saw in the chapter that, it warps native diplomacy. We saw that in Lawson's account, and we see it here in this reading. That friends could quickly become enemies based on the motivations of and the allure of this trade. Very good. Anything else? There's a lot of descriptions you could use, but anything else? Those are some good ones. All right. I'm not going to get to this in the PowerPoint, so I want to ask you now, what can you tell me about captivity and slavery before the arrival of Europeans? And then I'm going to ask you, how does this change? Chase.
It was mostly a byproduct of war. It wasn't the main cause of war.
Very good. That's one big answer, that it's a byproduct of war at this time and not the cause of war. And as we'll see as Europeans arrive, that is motivating peoples to attack one another. Good. What else? What else about Indian slavery or captivity during the Mississippian period, the era of the chiefdoms and before Europeans arrive, even though Europeans will arrive during the Mississippian period? Yeah, Kevin.
It's like a much smaller scale.
Good.
Pick it up a lot when the European market comes for slaves.
All right. The second big difference here is just the scale of captivity. That it's going to grow exponentially, and that the commodification of human bodies was unprecedented before the arrival of Europeans, meaning that they didn't get slaves, they didn't get captives for an export economy. And when Europeans arrive, that is going to greatly change the whole situation. And we'll talk more about how that connects to this idea of the shatter zone and things of that nature. Good. There's some other things we could talk about, but I want to move along. 2 other people I want to introduce that we'll also talk about in a minute. The Iroquois and the Westo. Iroquois, where are they located? Great Lakes, upstate New York. Very good. That's a long way away from the lower south. So what in the world do they have to do with this story? Yeah, Courtney.
It drives down people to the south.
Good. They are going to attack their neighbors near and far, and they are going to drive peoples from their homelands. And one group, and there's lots of groups that are going to be displaced, like we see later on in the lower south. But one of those groups are the Westo. And who are the Westo originally? That best as we know? The Erie Indians, who are next door neighbors of the Iroquois, the 5 nations. And they will be forced down to the south, also seeking trade. And why are the Westo important to this story? Yeah.
They kind of mimic Iroquois tactics, like restricting trade from other tribes.
Very good. They basically bring Iroquois tactics to the south. And they bring these slave raiding expeditions, although we'll talk more about Iroquois warfare and the reasons for their war. But the Westo will bring these slave raiding tactics down to the south, and they're going to wreak havoc on their neighbors. And we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, they also traded captured slaves to the English for firearms too, just like the Chickasaws did.
Very good. And you'll see the Westo, they will establish and maintain trading relationships with the English in Virginia first, and then on down to South Carolina when that colony is founded. So very good. And I think last question of the day. We'll talk about why Indians attack one another, but I want you to tell me, for our last question before we get to this, is why is the Yamasee War important? The slave trade and the Yamasee War in terms of its legacy. Forget about the details of the war and what happens. But why are these 2 things, the slave trade and the Yamasee War, what's their legacy and why is it significant? What happens? You can give me a couple. Ian.
It scares people away from using Indian slaves because they are afraid of a rebellion.
Good. One thing that you see is that, for all intents and purposes, the Yamasee War ends the slave trade. Now, Snyder argues that it doesn't destroy the slave trade, but it pretty much just ends the slave trade because within a few years, the slave trade in terms of official sponsorship, in terms of the scale, all that's going to implode. It's not going to be anymore. What else? Legacy. What are the legacies? What else do we have? One more.
Like we kind of said earlier, it marks an end to certain ways of native diplomacy. It's that war is so violent and so treacherous. And the people are so decimated afterwards.
Okay. And I'll carry that idea a little bit further and say we're going to see a major shift in the geopolitical makeup of the Southeast. And who wants to elaborate? Were you going to go that way or somewhere else?
I was going to say it led to the rise of African American slavery in the South.
Very good.
They'd use them instead, even though they were more expensive and taxed at a higher rate.
Very good. There's two answers that I'm looking for, and I think we're getting into both of those answers. One is that the Indian slave trade provides the foundation for the growth of this plantation economy and this plantation complex in South Carolina. And we'll talk details about why, but it's intimately connected to that growth. What else?
It begins to create this feeling of pan-Indianism among the Indians in the South.
Okay. I'd qualify that with yes and no. You do see the Yamasee conflict as kind of a pan-Indian type of movement, but you're going to see much more so later on when you get into the American Revolution and the 1790s and the War of 1812. But yeah, I think you can see the beginnings there and I think the important point here is that it's not, we say it's the Yamasee War, but it's not just the Yamasee who are attacking South Carolina. That there's a lot of other groups that will join them, and we'll talk about those reasons. And the last thing I wanted you to get out of this was a major shift in the makeup of the Southeast. And was that where you were going?
I was going to say maybe is also making them realize that a more separation between the colonists and the natives themselves, like they couldn't really work together.
Okay, you definitely see a change in the relationship. And one thing that's going to change is that the site of native power, and this kind of gets to our last answer, the site of native power is going to shift to the interior, and that the main aspect of this relationship in terms of trade is going to be built on the deerskin trade, not on human bodies. And along with that, the shift in power, the answer I was looking for is these large polities, confederacies, nations. We're trying to struggle with terms to how to describe them, but these nations that will form in the Southeast. So you're talking about the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and so forth. This is going to be this process of coalescence that we'll finish our talk with today. All right, very good. Any questions before we turn to this? Any questions? Anytime you have a question during the slides, just feel free to ask. All right. Now let's turn to the PowerPoint here to give this discussion a little bit more structure and to add some details about some things that we've already been talking about. And our story today begins with Thomas Nairn. Nairn was from Scotland, and sometime in the late 17th century, he settled in the neighborhood of Port Royal, South Carolina. He's what we would consider to be an expert in Indian affairs. He had experience in the Indian trade. He had experience leading military expeditions against native peoples. He was an early agent for the colony, which means he negotiated with native leaders. And he was so important to Carolina's Indian affairs that he helped draft many of the early laws that were related to the Indian trade. Now, Nairn was also a pretty good observer of Indian peoples and cultures, and he wrote a lot of this stuff down in letters and journals and so forth. And this is a pretty good collection that the evidence is featured prominently in our reading today. I've used it for my own research, and scholars really tap into this to learn more about the South, the Lower South, to learn about the British Empire and native peoples. Now, Nairn, as you know from the reading, Nairn probably would have written more, except for the fact that in 1715, Yamasee warriors filled his body with burning splinters and tortured him over the course of several days. And so part of the question that we want to ask and answer today is why? Why did the Yamasee, I mean, these were his neighbors. This attack occurred in the main Yamasee town of Pocataligo, which is in the vicinity of Port Royal, and Nairn was a frequent visitor of the Yamasee. So the question is, why did the Yamasee kill Nairn in 1715, and why at that same time did diverse native peoples launch an all-out attack against South Carolina? And of course, the answer, there's multiple answers, but the answer largely has to do with the Indian slave trade. And we're going to focus on the years 1670 to 1720. This is the height of the slave trade. It's important to remember, though, that as we talked about, that Indian slavery and captivity did not begin in 1670. That for generations, for hundreds if not thousands of years, native peoples had been practicing their own cultural forms of captivity and slavery. And as you mentioned over here as well, the slave trade did not begin in 1670. That peoples like the Occaneechi in Virginia and the Westo were trading slaves to the Virginians before 1670. But 1670 is nevertheless a watershed moment in the history of the South. One reason, it's because the colony of Carolina is founded, and from that point on, the slave trade will spread to the interior of the Lower South, and it will grow exponentially. All right. The other thing I want to mention before we move on to the Iroquois is that, as one historian has written, and this is why we're going to spend so much time with this, is that it's the Indian slave trade that is the decisive factor, all right, that shaped both colonial and native worlds for 50 years. And we'll also finish with the legacy, so that really doesn't end in 1715 or 1720, but this continues on, as you mentioned, Adam, for the legacy of the Old South and the beginnings of the Old South. So, all right, my clicker doesn't work, so I'm going to have to do this manually here. All right, so interestingly, as we talked about, we're not going to start in the Lower South, but we're going to turn to the Iroquois. The Iroquois, the Five Nations, will establish a very powerful confederacy sometime, as best we know, between 1450 and 1525. Now, that's up for debate, but nevertheless, from the Seneca people in the west all the way to the Mohawk in the east, the Five Nations will become a very powerful confederacy. And they occupy a very strategic position in the region, especially when we look at, and I'll throw that up there, the arrival of Europeans in the 17th century. You have the French who are going to colonize the St. Lawrence Valley, their colony of New France. They'll come down to the Great Lakes, eventually the Ohio country, down the Mississippi into the lower Mississippi Valley. You also have the Dutch along the Hudson River. The Dutch in the 17th century have one of the greatest commercial empires of any nation. And they're going to establish a mercantile venture, for the most part, that along the Hudson Valley that penetrates deep into the interior of modern New York. And of course, the English, we've already talked about New England. They are going to rapidly colonize and establish multiple colonies in what becomes New England. Now, Europeans are going to bring three crucial elements to these exchanges. They're going to bring disease, they're going to bring markets, global markets, and they're going to bring guns. And the Iroquois are especially going to use these. Their connections with the Dutch and later the English, they're especially going to use these as part of a very culturally specific type of warfare called the Morning War. And these are basically raids for captives. And so they are going to attack their neighbors near and far in order to weaken their enemies and to strengthen their own numbers. The Iroquois had been taking a hit from warfare, from disease, and and of course they also have the cultural reasons. And what do I mean by that when it comes to kinship? Why else we didn't talk about this in the discussion, but why else are there motivations for war, especially when you put it within the context of clan or kinship? Any ideas? Yeah?
Was it basically just to have that power over all the other tribes, maybe?
Well, certainly it was about power, because a clan the number of people that were in a clan, brought them power. What else?
Didn't they hold grudges for a while over different affairs or different attacks and violence between tribes?
Good. And you can call it the law of clan revenge or condolence or whatever. But kin people had an obligation to alleviate their deceased kin in terms of going out and getting new captives, bringing them into the family, or ritually torturing those. And it's not just all about captivity and bringing them into the community. It's also very violent, very deadly type of warfare here. And so if you look at this image here, and unfortunately I don't have all the backstory of this image, but if you look at the image and you see here two Iroquois warriors on the right, what are some things you can pull out of this image to kind of reinforce some things that we've been saying? What do you notice that is worth mentioning? Rich?
Well, the obvious bondage that the man in the middle is in, and the guy in the back is controlling him with a weapon.
All right, very good.
Firearm.
First of all, you see
very telling.
Yes, that's quite prominent. What are these? Heads. I thought they were scalps, but maybe they are heads. Yeah, you definitely see the gun, which is important to this warfare. And if you look at the unfortunate person in the middle, would you say that he's going to be adopted into these Iroquois clans, or do you think he's up for a horrible fate? What would be your guess based on the evidence?
I'd say horrible fate.
Why?
Well, oftentimes whenever they would take captives for adoption, they take women and children so that way they could reproduce for that reason. And also he seems pretty depressed, so I just going with it from that too.
His head's down, yeah. There's a couple good points there. One is that, men were adopted into clans, of course, but as we read about and so forth, that, largely you see women and children who are targeted for captivity and for adoption. Also, his head down. What else do you notice about the man in the middle that might tip you off to not a very good fate? We haven't really been studying Native American history a lot in this class. We're kind of shifting gears a little bit. So you might, what is this? It's not a fair question. All right, yeah. It's not a weapon. You probably wouldn't want to give your victim a weapon, because that could turn on you real quick. But it's most likely a death rattle. And so this is most likely, and he's tied with a halter. We'll see a picture of a halter, an 18th century halter in a second. But he's most likely destined for a horrible fate and not to be adopted into these communities. Now, I also want to stress that there's economic reasons for war. It's not just about mourning war and replacing lost, kinsmen. But you also have the Iroquois who are expanding to try to prevent others, their rivals, from getting access to European trade. They're trying to expand their hunting territories, especially with the all-important beaver trade. So both of these factors kind of go together in the Iroquois attacking their neighbors. And this is going to be important to our story because this greatly destabilizes the region. And so in the early days, they're going to start by attacking their near neighbors, other Iroquoian speakers, people like the Huron and the Neutral and the Susquehanna and the Erie. And then many of these peoples, if they're not incorporated or killed into their communities, that many of them will try to seek protection elsewhere. They'll become displaced. And many of them will move further west, and the Iroquois will follow them. Their attacks will be as far as the Illinois country along the Mississippi River. They'll attack peoples in the south. But as we mentioned, there's one group that does more damage in a very short period of time in the south, and that's the Westo. And the Westo were originally Erie Indians. The Erie are Iroquoian speakers. They're made up of a confederation of villages that include Erie and other remnant groups like the Hurons and the Neutrals. And the Erie will relocate from pressure from the Iroquois, but also to access English trade. They will relocate to the Falls of Virginia in the mid-17th century. And they're not really welcome there. The English don't really want them there, and the Occaneechi, who are a powerful group near the falls of the James River, don't want them there either. But nevertheless, they establish, for the short stay that they have there, they establish trading relationships with the English, and they will trade and sell slaves, Indian slaves, to the English in Virginia. But about 1660, they're going to relocate to the Savannah River area, where they become known officially as the Westo. And they're going to attack peoples in the Carolina Piedmont. They're going to attack groups in Georgia and Florida as well. And I'm not going to get into all the backstory here, but their reign is short-lived. There's a faction within South Carolina called the Goose Creek Men. We mentioned them last class. There's many of them Barbadians, aggressive planters. Well, they resent the Westoe monopoly, and they want to open up trade to the interior. And so they secretly recruit another group of Indians, the Shawnee Indians, who are known, a group of Shawnee known as the Savannah. And they will arm them, and these Savannahs will come down and pretty much wipe out the Westoe. In a war between 1680 and 1682, the Westoe are going to take a big hit. That there's only about 50 Westoe remaining at the end of that war, and by 1715, they disappear from the records altogether. The Westoe War is important because it opens up the interior to trade. So the English are going to begin to trade to a much greater degree with peoples well beyond the coast, the Atlantic coast, deep into the interior. And we read a lot about the Chickasaw and this English-Chickasaw alliance. And they are strategically located, much like the Iroquois were, they are strategically located in the lower Mississippi. Major trade routes, waterways, and land paths. You've got nearby, you've got the Mississippi River and the Tennessee River. You also have land paths such as the Natchez Trace, which goes north to south, and the Creek Path, which goes from Charleston east-west all the way to the Chickasaw villages. And so they are going to tap in, like the Iroquois did with the Dutch and the English, they're going to tap into this trade. And they are going to be about the only people in this region that have access to guns. And they're going to use that to attack their neighbors. And they attack on both sides of the Mississippi River, but they especially target the Choctaw. See here circled in red along the Pearl River in the Mississippi region. And the Choctaw are a pretty powerful people. They're about 3 times more populous than the Chickasaw, but they don't have guns, and they're ethnically and politically divided. And so there's going to be this nasty war, a series of raids that will go back and forth between the heavily armed Chickasaw and the Choctaw. And I'll give you a couple statistics, and these are not completely accurate, but we see, for example, in one decade, it's estimated that the Chickasaw capture 500 Choctaw and kill 1,800. So one, it lets you know how destructive these slave raids were, but also the human toll that was taken. And in addition, it tells you that the Choctaw, as Snyder writes, were not passive victims, and that they targeted the Chickasaw as well. When they came down for their raids, on the way back to their villages, their hunting grounds. And in that same decade that I just mentioned those other statistics, in that same 10-year period, it's estimated that 800 Chickasaw were killed through this warfare. Now, the playing field is going to become a little bit more level later on when the French will arrive in the lower Mississippi. They're going to construct these native alliances, and they're going to supply them with guns. And so the warfare between the Chickasaw and Choctaw will continue, but much more level. All right. 2 other people. We could talk about different groups that become slave raiders all day. There's lots that we could mention, but 2 more that I want to just introduce very quickly because they are important to our story later are the Yamasee and the Creek. And these are new peoples that are forming, these confederacies that are emerging, both the Yamasee and the Creek. They're made up of remnant populations from chiefdoms that have collapsed, from villages that have been targeted by slave raiders, and those that have been hit hard by disease. And so the Yamasee and the Creek are important because along with the Chickasaw, they are going to be the principal slavers, the principal allies of the English from the mid-1680s on to the Yamasee War. And they are especially going to target people where?
In Florida.
All right, very good. And I'm going to have you guys do some work here in a second, so stay with me. They are especially going to target peoples in Florida. And we've already kind of introduced this. Florida is strategically important to the Spanish. Very important. Because a lot of the New World wealth that's coming out of Central and South America is being shipped around the coast of Florida back to Spain. And so as a military outpost, it's very, very significant to their empire. But Florida is on the northern fringes of this Spanish empire. And it's a weak outpost. And they're more concerned with bringing this mission system to native peoples of the region, trying to convert them, trying to assimilate them, and it has limited success. I'm not going to get into all the details there because we have a short class. But they're particularly active among people like the Appalachian, who we read about. A group of about 10,000 or more heavily fortified towns around modern Tallahassee. And they're going to have a fairly close, not a perfect relationship, but a fairly close relationship with the Spanish. So while they're formidable, the odds are against them because these enslavers who are coming down are bent on getting slaves and they're heavily armed. And so they are going to, if you look on the map here on the right, if you look on the map, you can see that as early as the late 1650s up into 1711 to the getting towards the Tuscarora and Yamasee War, you can see how extensive these raids were. That they even went to the tip of the Florida Keys looking for Indian slaves. The slave raiding will intensify with Queen Anne's War. And that's an imperial conflict between 1702 and 1713, and this is going to unleash a slaving frenzy. One reason is because it really interrupts transatlantic commerce. You have the price of African slaves that are tripled, and so peoples like in South Carolina, like Carolinians, will see this as an opportunity to get slaves. And one of the most destructive raids, I think, that you read about was the former governor of South Carolina, James Moore, who leads about 50 whites and more than 1,000 Indians, Yamasee, Creeks, and others, down into Florida, attacking the Appalachian and others. And he wrote lots of letters about how destructive these raids were. And we did mention what happened to the Appalachian. His claims might be exaggerated in those letters, but thousands were sold into slavery. Some were incorporated into Yamasee and Creek communities and others. You had a number, like we said, that went to maybe 800 that went to French Louisiana to establish that connection and alliance. And you had maybe 1,000 or so that relocated to the Savannah River area to be under the protection of the English. And they will actually participate in some slave raiding after that. Okay, the last thing I want to mention about this before we move on to something else is that the end result of these slave raids is devastating for the Spanish and for Florida. And that Florida is largely depopulated of Indians, not completely, but largely. And the other thing is that it pretty much ends the mission system. This is a mid-18th century map. It's a little bit later, but I highlighted in yellow just some of the descriptions that were included in this map. And it pretty much is talking about commemorating English victories. I don't think you can read it. Maybe you can if you have better eyes than me. But commemorating English victories from 1702, 1703 in the top one. In the middle one, it talks about how these settlements were abandoned. And a lot of the missions in this mission system were located along this road here. This is where most of the missions were. And so they are destroyed, and then have down like here the Timacuas being destroyed as well. So it takes a pretty heavy toll on Florida. All right. Now we're going to stop for a second. Let me check my clock with my old-fashioned phone. Okay. Let's ask the question that Snyder asks. And I'm going to answer the first one for you because we've already done that. But then I want you to look at this next document and tease out some information. So, why did Indians raid for slaves? Why did they participate in this toxic trade? And one big reason is, for protection and alliance. If you don't have access to guns, then there's a good chance that you're a victim. So almost being forced to take part in this slave trade to ensure your own autonomy and your survival. And also alliance, that it's important to ally with powerful peoples. And the English will bring these guns and will bring this power. And so for many, they're a good people to connect with. Other reasons, but the second reason I want to talk about is what I think Richie started, going down that road, and that is these economic motivations for slave raiding. And I hope it's okay if I can just cut down for just a second these lights, and just look at this document for a second. 1716. What's going on here in this document? What is it? Receipt. Close. Who wants to elaborate? What What's going on in this document? What is this about? If you're a historian, you find this in the archives. It's in this writing that's hard to, to get into.
Is it a list of slaves?
Not slaves, but it's a schedule of, on the very line up here, a schedule of prices. Prices. And this is for the deerskin trade. All right? So on the left here, you have goods, and on the right, there's 3 columns. On the left, you have goods, and on the right, what's the payment for these goods? If you're an Indian, how are you paying for these goods?
Buckskin.
Buckskins, deerskins, very good. So again, telling you that this is 1716, so remember that the deerskin trade is very important to these relationships, especially with the English. But what I want to do now is to look at these economic motivations and to bring in a quote from Thomas Nairn. And he said, he wrote that, one slave could bring in a whole estate at once. And then he gave some detail. He said, for one slave, you could get a gun, ammunition, a horse. That's a dubious claim, the horse. A hatchet and a suit of clothes. And so what I want to do real quick before we move on is to make a few comparisons about how much one slave could bring in terms of deerskins. So anybody here decent at math? I know you raised your hand, but they pulled it down. Is that?
Well, I remember the number from the reading, so I was.
No, you can't do that. It's not going to match up to that number. I know if we're history majors that math's not our strong point, but is there anybody here who would be willing to write down a few numbers and tally them up? I'm not going to volunteer. Calculate? Well, if you want to be modern. Okay. Can you do that for me?
I will do that.
All right. So let's go through this list real quick. And a gun, how much is that? 30 skins. Very good. Next, ammunition. What do you see here for ammunition?
50 bullets is 1 skin.
All right. Let's do that. Let's do 1 skin and throw in one more aspect of that trade. And let's do this. What's this? 18 flints. So let's do that. That'll be enough for ammunition, although it might be more. All right, forget the horse because there's a good chance that this is an exaggeration. Horses were part of the trade, but I doubt that every Indian who brought in a slave received a horse. Maybe some of the most noted warriors and headmen, but these were very valuable animals and commodities at this time. Later on, they'd be traded illegally as well, much more extensively. So let's skip that because that would be something that would not even be on this list because they're so valuable. How about a hatchet? 2, very good. And a suit of clothes, we're going to have to mix and match a few descriptions here to come up with a number. What are some items here that you think would be part of this suit of clothes?
A shirt.
A shirt, good. How much? 4 skins. What else in that first column do you think is not only valuable, but a typically traded item?
Blanket.
Good. A Duffield blanket, 14. And that was often worn as an overcoat. So this was typical. And don't forget the ladies. Oftentimes the men would get goods for daughters and wives and mothers. And so let's throw in there, what else can we throw in there? How about here? Yeah, let's do that, 12. All right, what do we got, Nicole? I'll cut the lights back on.
93.
93. Okay, it doesn't quite match up with what we said, and what was the number from the book?
I think it was 160, if I'm not mistaken.
160 skins in terms of one slave. So even if you get in the range of 80, which a good hunter at this time could bring in 70 to 80 skins or more. So you have the option of hunting deer, the labor and the effort required in that to get 160 or 80 deer skins, or you could get 1 slave, which is much more dangerous, but much, as you said, much more valuable. And so these are a couple of the main reasons on why Indians are attacking each other. Now let's flip the coin. And we've already talked about this, but what happens to Indian slaves? We've already kind of answered this. Let's just go over it real quick.
They were either employed on agricultural farms or shipped to the West Indies to do the same.
Good. So where? West Indies.
New England.
New England. Hint, hint. Where else?
Virginia.
Some early on especially were traded to Virginia to work on tobacco plantations. And the Carolinas, very good. So what do we, and I'll just throw up my fancy arrows here. You had a number that were traded to New England, as we see with this advertisement. a Carolina Indian boy, that's how they were often described, Spanish Indians or Carolina Indians that would be brought to work in the domestic economy up there, household labor in many ways. We've already read a lot about the West Indies this semester and the voracious demand that they had for labor and for human bodies, and indentured servitude, Indian slaves, and then African labor that they would use to, especially in the sugar plantations. And of course, as you said at the end there, many of them were also put to work on South Carolina plantations. And you can see here with this statistic, this is no small number, that the estimates are from census records that about a quarter or more of the slave population were Native American. Now, this wasn't in the reading, it was in the reading, but not to any great detail. But does this date have any importance for us here in terms of what we're going to turn to next as we kind of finish up this presentation with a few more slides? Not the Yamasee War, but do you remember anything that we talked about it with Lawson, in fact? Remember that picture of Lawson, that original drawing? Yeah. It's North Carolina is what I'm thinking of. And this, it very well could be that this Carolina Indian boy was taken during this war in North Carolina.
Was that when he was captured with an African slave
Yes.
and another
Remember that war?
person? Yeah, and then the other two were let go, but he was
Yes.
kept, and they actually killed him.
Now you got to give me the name of the war.
Oh.
See, that's since I'm not teaching in the South, you know this if you were from North Carolina. Yes.
Is it the Tuscarora War?
Very good. Very good. The Tuscarora War. Very nice. And so this is a war from 1711 to 1713. I'm not going to get into all the details. The Tuscarora, as you see on the far right there, North Carolina is expanding. The Tuscarora respond. North Carolina calls on their southern neighbor for help. And of course, South Carolina looks at that and says, looks like a great opportunity to get slaves. And so they are joined by a number of allies, including the Yamasee, who are going to go into North Carolina and turn this into a slave raiding exercise. And thousands of Tuscarora are going to be sold into slavery. There's also going to be a number of them in later decades that will travel north to become part of the Iroquois Confederacy. And that's when you have the shift in language from the 5 nations to the 6 nations. Some will remain in North Carolina. But with that said, now I want to turn to looking at the causes of the Yamasee War, and then we'll get to the legacy. So the causes of the Yamasee War, one of the big ones is linked to what we see with their engagement with the Tuscarora War, and that is the slave population is dwindling. Where are we going to get more slaves? And they start to see that, well, we probably will have to start attacking each other. And so the question is, are we next? That's factoring into their decisions on what to take away from the Tuscarora War and this long-standing trade in Indian slaves that they've been participating in. The second thing that you see is trader abuse. And that is an older notion. It's still relevant, but in the old days, this is what historians would explain. This is how they'd explain the war, that it was these traders. You can't trust them. They're out there. They're living in Indian communities, and they're cheating and harassing and killing their native clients sometimes, that they have horrible behavior towards native women. And as a result, the Yamasee can't take it anymore, and they erupt into war, and others will follow. And it's no surprise that one of the first acts of the war is the killing of traders, about 100 or so that are scattered throughout these communities throughout the Lower South. Now, more recent scholarship basically says, while that's a relevant answer, it's much more complicated than that. And we also have to look at such things as settler encroachment that factors into this, the failures of South Carolina diplomacy, where any reforms in the trade were not about, justice to their native clients, but it was more about getting control of the trade and exerting their authority. And of course, the slave trade itself as a major reason for the Yamasee War. There's this endless cycle of debt. Native peoples find it hard to repay their creditors. And so for some, when this war erupts, they want to drive the English into the ocean and kill every one of them. For others, they want to reform the trade. and to bring it back to their terms. So these are all reasons that factor into why the Yamasee and others are going to erupt in warfare. And you can see on this map here that the darker shade of this circle here, these are what one historian has called the core nations that participated in these attacks against Carolina. These are the Creek peoples here. These are going to be the lower and upper Creeks later on as they emerge. But the other groups are these auxiliary or Confederate nations that participate in a limited way in the Yamasee War. Okay, so while I have, I'm not going to get into the details of this conflict. Carolina, I think about 7% of the population is wiped out in this conflict. They are going to recruit African slaves, native allies such as the Cherokee, and they're eventually going to drive the Yamasee out. The war ends, but what's most important are our last 3 slides. And suddenly the eyes are awake. What? About that? And that is the legacy of the war and the slave trade itself. And the first thing, as we've talked about, is that it pretty much ends the slave trade. So halters like this one, we saw in that picture, halters like this one, although this comes from the northern woodlands, I believe, will be in use, continue to be in use, but you will not see the scale, the scope, the range of the slave trade and slave raiding expeditions. So one is we see the end of the slave trade. And this has an effect on the South Carolina Indian population, Indian slave population, that within a generation you see it drop from a quarter or more to a minimal 2% of the slave population. The second legacy of this slave trade and of this war is this shatter zone that is created. And this is a term that's been popularized by the anthropologist Robbie Etheridge, talking about this region in upheaval. And the 2 major things that create this shatter zone are disease, which we haven't talked about a lot, but these epidemics, these recurring epidemics that are decimating populations, disease and commerce. And of course by commerce we mean the Indian slave trade. And this might be, again, these are best estimates from scholars who are working in this area. And that is, it could be as many as 50,000 who were enslaved during this period. And again, that doesn't include those that died from disease, that died from warfare, from raiding, and so forth. So another thing that we see as a consequence of this shatter zone, and we get a sense of this with this map, is the coalescence of powerful native communities. As a site of native power shifts to the interior of the Lower South, and this diversity. It's not a perfect map here, but this diversity that we once see in the native South is now erased to a large extent as these powerful nations, these powerful confederacies and peoples are going to emerge. And again, the deerskin trade is going to take over more so than the slave trade, and that's going to dominate the relationship there. And last but not least, Adam, I think you gave us this answer in the discussion. What we see here is the beginnings of the Old South, and that you cannot understand our next book, Rice and Slaves. You cannot, Black Majority. You cannot understand this shift to African slavery and this shift to rice production without appreciating what happens in this era of the Indian slave trade. And one of the things that we've talked about throughout this semester in terms of Virginia or New England or elsewhere is the importance of capital. And we talked a lot about that capital is needed to grow these plantations and these economies. And the slave trade allows for that. So that one is, Indian slaves are producing commodities on these low country plantations, and also that the slaves themselves are commodities, being sold and traded. And so it allows for this, and they can reinvest their money. These planters can reinvest their money on African slaves. And I'm going to throw up one more chart here, one more graph, to show you the tremendous, and in a very quick time, the growth of this plantation economy. So look at there on the chart at the top. This is rice export, 1698, just a mere 5 tons. By 1730, 10,000 tons of rice. So you can see a major shift to a rice producing and exporting economy, which we'll talk about next class and thereafter. And then you see here the slave population of South Carolina that in 1708, African slaves make up about 30% of the population. 16 years, this is a very short window of time, 16 years later, more than 2/3 of the entire population, that's including the English, white population, 2/3 of the entire population is made up of African slaves. As we talked about, many of them have come from the West Indies, and others will later come directly from Africa. So that's the end of the PowerPoint that I have to recap some of the things we talked about. Are there any questions before we leave for today about these things we've been talking about? Any questions? Yeah.
Did the Indian population, after the slave trade ended, did they intermingle with the African slave populations?
Yes.
Were they separated from?
Yes. No. In fact, that's a very good question, and scholars have written about these connections because, as one of you said, I think it was you, Chase, many of these captives that are coming from native communities are women and children. And a large number of these slaves coming from the West Indies and Africa are male in these early years. And so you have this, this intermixing, this intermarriage, and scholars have talked about these unions, but also the cultural influences that both Africans and native peoples had to the shaping of low country culture. So that's a really good question. Anything else? Anything else before we go? All right, very good. Don't forget we have our reading for Wednesday, and we'll turn to looking more at this rice economy.
Join us each Saturday evening at 8 p.m. and midnight Eastern for classroom lectures from across the